Good. So I'm very happy to be here at this, take part at this important meeting on the role of the intellectual in times of turmoil. That the present time definitely qualifies. Ways of looking at Europe's troubled Geist. I don't know if you know, but one of the big philosophers of the Geist is buried right at the other side of this wall, Hegel. There is a cemetery around the street where you can find Geist. The Geist here is at home, and I'm very happy to be able to moderate this evening with Patrice, a dear colleague from the University of Lille. So, as you perhaps already know, Patrice is a professor of philosophy, an emeritus professor of philosophy at Lille, together with Sequoia Yeki. He's the editor of the series Études Véliniennes, Velian Studies. In Lille, we have the Institute of Eric Weil. Eric Weil was a philosopher who was working for many years in Lille, and his papers are still there. And Patrice was running this institute. Patrice published several books on Eric Weil and various studies on Aristotle and Kant, Hegel, Rousseau, Hannah Arendt, Paul Ricoeur, as well as books and articles on the problems of contemporary political philosophy. Among the issues that he was dealing with is the issue of education for democratic citizenship, the specificity of political action, the problem of national identities and nationalism, the logic of compromise making, and so forth. Forthcoming is Eric Weil, Philosopher avec critique, philosophizing with critique, articles and notes, critical notes publiées dans la Revue Critique. And there is another book forthcoming that I happen to know about, which is about Rousseau. Mm-hmm. And without much further ado, I will now give the words to Patrice to talk about Europe at the crossroads and the political relevance of intellectual dialogue.
Thank you very much, Elad. I would like to thank the Catholic Academy in Berlin and the ESA for their kind invitation. I am honored and pleased to be here with you, so thank you very much. I will talk about the role of the intellectuals in contemporary democracies. Europe finds itself in the midst of a double crisis. I agree with the fact that there's been a lot of progress made over the past decades, but I'm still using the word crisis for reasons that I will maybe have the opportunity to clarify in the discussion. Europe finds itself in the midst of a double crisis with the rise of illiberal democracies and the reshaping of the so-called world order. All over the world, including Europe, illiberal and autocratic regimes are on the rise, and the illiberal temptation is present even in countries with strong democratic traditions. The conflict between constitutional democracies and autocratic regimes is at the heart of the current struggle for a new international order, or more precisely, for a new international hierarchy. In this context, the confidence that we have in our shared democratic and humanist values is in crisis. Not only is there a debate about how these values should be interpreted, which is normal, it also seems that these values are no longer widely shared. Significant sections of the public no longer take democratic principles and the rule of law for granted. As a result, the use of violence is no longer taboo, not only in international relations, but also within our own societies. In this talk, I will develop a few remarks on the responsibility of intellectuals within this context. However, it seems to me that the term intellectuals refers to two different kinds of people. On the one hand, we are talking about teachers, professors, scholars, faculty members, etc. On the other hand, we are talking about people who speak in the media or in the press, writers, essayists, and so on. We have in mind the example of Émile Zola, writing his famous article in support of Dreyfus. And of course, but these people are two different kinds of intellectuals. Of course, there is an overlap between these two groups. Historians or philosophers take part in public debates on television, but not every scholar is willing to do so. In any case, these two types of intellectuals have in common the fact that they participate in the formation of public opinion. Teachers and professors contribute to the education of future citizens. Intellectuals in the media or in the press are more directly involved in shaping public opinion. In principle, the roles of these two types of intellectuals are complementary, but they can conflict with each other. Scholars and researchers are often critical of highly publicized intellectuals, and the two types of intellectuals have their own limits. The limits of specialization, sometimes hyper-specialization in the case of academics, and the fact that some public intellectuals tend to overstep the boundaries of their competence and become experts in everything and anything. We should also not forget that intellectuals can play a negative role in public debate. For example, by fueling ideological conflicts, providing arguments for the most radical and potentially violent positions, and so on. But this does not prevent us from asking the question about the role of intellectuals. On the contrary, what is this role in a democracy? What is it supposed to be? In this presentation, I will not argue that the intellectuals have an entirely new and original function to perform in the current state of crisis. Rather, I will start with a description of this function that seems to me to be consensual, and I will try to contextualize this function, that is, to relate it to our present situation. We all know what democracy means. A functionary democracy is based on the rule of law, the fact that the same basic rights and freedoms are guaranteed to all citizens. Democracy means universal suffrage and the existence of a fair electoral system. It also means political alternation, the peaceful change of governments through regular elections. This implies freedom of individual expression, freedom of the press, political pluralism, etc. But the underlying principle of all these procedures and institutions is the principle of universal discussion. Democracy is not just a set of institutions, rules, and regulations. It is a method of government. It's not only about rights, basic rights, it's about making collective decisions. It's a political regime in which problems are solved through public and universal discussion, universal meaning that all citizens are entitled to participate in the discussion. In a democracy, there may be heated debates, conflicts of interests, ideological differences, but all citizens must share a basic fundamental value, which is the rejection of violence. If the problems of common concern are to be solved through discussion, the use of violent means must be strictly prohibited, and that is what is in question right now. However, Democracy also rests on an article of faith, which is that it is always possible to reach rational and effective decisions through the exchange of reasoned arguments. The moment we lose this faith in the possibility of making rational collective decisions through open discussion, the value of the democratic regime ceases to be self-evident. The dictatorship of a powerful and supposedly wise and well-inspired leader may seem preferable. Consequently, faith in the possibility and efficiency of rational discussion is crucial. And it really is a matter of faith. It is not a religious faith, but it's faith nonetheless, in the sense that it is not possible to demonstrate scientifically or philosophically that a population of tens or hundreds of millions of people can make rational decisions through open discussion, or at least be persuaded by reasoned argument to support rational policies. Now we speak of a crisis of democracy when democratic procedures do not work, when the rule of law is threatened, when those who govern do not respect the Constitution, when the citizens have no say in the decisions that concern them, when political alternation is prevented by more or less violent means, when the electoral system is being perverted by all sorts of maneuvers aiming at reducing the number of voters, redrawing electoral districts, etc. But more profoundly, there is a crisis when the very possibility of rational public discussion is questioned. Such a loss of faith in the possibility and effectiveness of rational and reasonable dialogue can be explained by various reasons. One of these reasons is the feeling that the state and the political class are ineffective, that citizens cannot make their voices heard, that the real problems are not being addressed. But the failure of education is another important reason. Modern democracy is based on the existence of mass education in primary schools, high schools, and universities. Therefore, access to education for all is vital for democracy. This means state funding and the development of an education system that provides not only vocational training, but also education in the broadest sense, including the teaching of the humanities, political sciences, etc. And this was an important point in the lecture that Professor Johnson gave yesterday. However, education is not only the responsibility of schools and universities. In fact, the entire democratic process is based on the mutual education of those who govern and those who are governed. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has developed the idea of an education or civilization of state power by civil society. In his essay on the European Constitution, Zur Verfassung Europas, he speaks of a process of legalization and civilization of state violence, and his idea is that the state is the institutionalization of power, particularly in the form of an administration, and that the exercise of the state power in the context of the state's monopoly on violence must be controlled and disciplined by civil society. Civil society must also compel the administration to deal with issues that it tends to ignore. And one of the tasks of civil society is thus to refocus the public debate on issues that are part of people's lived experience, but which remain peripheral to their government's agenda. The civic and social mobilizations currently developing all over the world illustrate the necessity for civil society to educate and discipline state power. It is universal experience that the political elites tend to be cut off from the lived experience of the majority, and that the situation of the most privileged segments of society is improving, while other segments tend to stagnate. Therefore, the necessity for civil society to exert educational pressure on state power, that is, on the ruling class, is part of the democratic process. However, civil society's pressure on governments and the state apparatus is ambivalent. The flows of communication that traverse civil society very seldom match the standards of well-grounded argumentation. Popular mobilizations rise against nepotism and corruption. In some cases, they oppose the dismembering of democratic institutions. In other cases, however, mass protests endanger the democratic process and put the very existence of democracy into question. Sometimes this involves an element of nihilistic violence and xenophobic trends. Social networks may offer spaces of discussion where well-argued positions confront each other. As we know, however, some of them deliberately misinform and favor the expression of extreme forms of social hatred. They give a semblance of legitimacy to the most aggressive forms of antisocial behavior and contribute to the disinhibition of violence. Consequently, another way of describing the crisis of a democratic system is to point out that such a system is based, in principle, is based on a virtuous circle that can turn into a vicious circle. The virtuous circle is the process, or would be the process, through which those who govern and those who are governed educate each other. Those who govern and those who aspire to govern, the leaders of the various political parties, must develop a political pedagogy for their fellow citizens, explaining the situation, the problem it poses, and the possible solutions. Conversely, citizens must put pressure on the government and its administration to respect the rules of constitutional government, avoid abuses of power, seek the common good and not just the good of a particular social stratum or party in power. Generally speaking, it is through the confrontation of different views, those of political personalities, of different political parties, of different social groups and strata of the population, that the biases of different points of view correct and complement each other. In principle, political discussion should be a forum for the mutual education of all participants. And the problem lies in the fact that the virtuous circle can degenerate into a vicious one in which demagogic politicians deceive the people with lies, false promises, and propaganda, while the people distrust the elites, reject scientific discourse, refuses to face real problems, etc. So, condescension and flattery on one side, and resentment and anger on the other. In this case, the mutual education of citizens and the political class fails. It turns into a process of counter-education that undermines the unity and cohesion of the political community. The democratic system begins to dysfunction. The regime favors the access to power of either authoritarian or mediocre leaders and leads the citizens to make nonsensical decisions. The principle of nonviolence is questioned, as is the idea of a public discussion in which only the force of the best argument prevails. So, the role of intellectuals. What is to be done? As the French-German philosopher Canivez says, coercion is sometimes necessary, but by no means sufficient. Incitement to racial hatred, political violence, etc., must be punished by law. But the only cure for bad discussion is more good public discussion. This is where intellectuals have a major role to play. Their role is to contribute to public debates, but also to raise the level of these debates to ensure that they don't fall below a certain level. In the context of modern democracies, this involves pursuing three main goals. First, intellectuals must enlighten both the public and the political class about the problems that require collective action. They must develop citizens' collective awareness of the problems. An obvious example of this are gender issues or the issue of climate change. Second, intellectuals must develop critical thinking about the functioning of social and political institutions in order to point out their shortcomings, expose cases of discrimination, injustice, and so on. Third, they must develop the debate on common values. In a democracy, whether within a country or within international institutions, the debate on values is essential because political action is always guided implicitly or explicitly by values, freedom, justice, independence, human dignity, and so on. Or more explicitly, political action is guided by a certain way of understanding those values. In the most general and abstract terms, all nations, states, women, and men, all political regimes have the same values. All of them claim to strive for freedom, democracy, basic rights, etc. The real differences are not only in the level of sincerity of all these fine proclamations, but also in the way these values are concretely conceived. This is because the implementation of a policy requires a detailed and concrete conception of what exactly freedom, solidarity, human rights, gender equality, etc. mean. We can reach consensus on the most abstract level. Nobody, almost nobody, claims to be in favor of slavery, exploitation, and mass murder. Dissensus appears when it comes to the policies that are required to implement those values, because concrete action implies detailed planning, administrative reforms, legislative initiatives, and this involves a concrete explicitation of what we mean by these values. I would now like to make some further comments on these three aspects of the intellectual's work in democratic context: the elucidation of problems in the pursuit of collective action, critical thinking, and the debate on common values, taking in consideration the present situation. So first, the elucidation of the problems that require collective action. We live in an increasingly interconnected world where the problems we need to address have a global dimension: climate change, poverty, and development, etc. Consequently, the role of intellectuals is to provide expertise, that is, to inform the public about the scientific, technical, economic data, as well as other data that must be taken into account in order to assess the relevance of a given policy. It should be noted that the knowledge needed to fully understand the problems we face is not only scientific and technical. Historical knowledge is also needed to understand where the problems come from. Such knowledge is also necessary for a nation or a group of nations to understand who they are in their inner diversity. This is obviously the case with regard to Europe and the European Union. What is at stake in the current transformation of the international order is the role that Europe will play in it. To answer this question, Europeans need a common understanding of the problems they must solve, but also a common vision of their future place in global society. Europe will either be a historical subject, that is, a significant partner in international cooperation, or it will be a kind of buffer zone between world powers whose interplay of influences and counter-influences determine its destiny. In general, historical self-understanding, including the history of religions, political traditions, etc., is essential for giving meaning to collective action. It is also a remedy for the oversimplifications and caricatures that fuel nationalist propaganda. But the main point is to insist on the dimensions of the problems, that is, to take into account the fact that it cannot be dealt with on the scale of a single country, however large that country may be. This emphasis on the dimension of problems is particularly important where the European Union is concerned. The EU is largely made up of small and medium-sized countries. On the 27 countries that make it up, only half a dozen have more than 20 million inhabitants. Even the most demographically and economically important countries, such as Germany, Italy, Poland, France, etc., can no longer solve the major problems on their own. One of the remedies for nationalism is raising the awareness of the existence of common problems that can only be solved through international cooperation, which means within Europe, but also on a larger scale, of course. In this view, the problem lies in the fact that international relations are a mixture of competition and partnership. On the one hand, there are traditional rivalries, economic, cultural, and even military, as Russia's war against Ukraine shows. On the other hand, even the great powers need to cooperate in some way, not only to avoid all-out war, but also to deal with global problems. As a result, the major and middle powers are rivals as well as partners. They may be in conflict on some issues, but they must cooperate on others. Given this combination of competition and partnership, the question is, what will prevail in the future? Competition or even violent conflict, or an even closer partnership among more and more countries? Awareness of the complexity and scale of these issues involved is also a factor that could lead to more international partnership and less international confrontation. So this is what intellectuals should help understand. And of course, I have in mind intellectuals in the sense of writers, essayists, journalists that take part in public debates in the newspapers and on the radio and television. A final remark on the question of understanding the problems to be solved by collective action. In contemporary democracies, the task of developing a synoptic view of the situation and its problems does not fall only to politicians and higher civil servants. It is not a reserved competence. On the contrary, the underlying principle of democracy is that each citizen is qualified to contribute to the discussion of public affairs and participate in the decision-making. When electing their representatives, citizens give support to a political party and its political agenda. Collectively, consciously or unconsciously, they decide on a course of action. That is why each citizen is supposed to be able to think politically. That is, to think as if they had to make the decision, as if they had to make the decision, as if they were the government. This is not merely a feature of democratic ethos. The ability to think politically is also implied in citizens' legal status. Modern democracy is not just about the governed choosing their rulers. It is not only defined by universal suffrage. It also means that every citizen is eligible for local, regional, or national office. In other words, citizens are considered by law as potential rulers. Of course, there are many obstacles in the way of participating in political life, financial obstacles, and so on and so forth. But by law, citizens are considered as potential rulers, not only as voters. Hence, the difference that Eric Weil makes between active and passive citizens. The difference is not that the former are social active citizens, that the former are social or political activists, while the others are content to lead a private life. The difference between active and passive citizens lies primarily in the way passive and active citizens think. Passive citizens simply react to governmental action by expressing their socio-economic interests and/or their moral convictions concerning, for example, bioethical issues, the national identity, and so on. Active citizens envisage the problems as if they were the government, as if they were responsible for solving them. In addition to expressing their interests or moral convictions, they must be able to critically examine the solutions proposed by the platforms of political parties. This is, of course, the ideal case. As we all know, the reality is quite different. Most citizens merely react to the actions of the government. They react more or less emotionally to the current situation, both nationally and internationally. As a result, the ratio of active citizens in this sense to passive citizens is highly variable. We could say that one of the tasks of intellectuals is to, in a democratic context, is to ensure that there are more and more active citizens in Weil's sense, that is, citizens who think about problems as potential rulers and not only as subjects in the political sense, that is, as individuals who are subjected to their rulers and can only react by revolting against these rulers and the political institutions. Second, critical thinking. We must take into account the concrete context in which intellectuals' critical thinking takes place. Intellectuals are not disembodied persons. They live in a society in which they communicate with all other members, groups, and communities that make up society. What motivates their criticism are certain feelings that they share with all the others. A sense of irrationality and efficiency in the face of dysfunctional social and political institutions, a sense of injustice in the face of inequality, discrimination, and abuse of power, a sense of meaninglessness in the face of a society based on material progress and competition that offers no prospect of a meaningful life. In all cases, these are feelings of revolt that intellectuals share with their fellow citizens, within the state, and with members of society in general. However, this feeling of revolt can be expressed in different ways. It can lead to various forms of violence, violence against others or against oneself, in the form of irrational processes of self-destruction, like drug addiction and so on and so forth. The violence can be individual and collective, or collective, rejection of laws and institutions, systematic destruction during demonstration or mass protests, radical terrorism, and so on. In this context, the development of critical thinking has two main aspects. On the one hand, it aims at elaborating the feelings of revolt and dissatisfaction into a coherent and well-reasoned discourse. The elaboration of a sentiment into a coherent discourse is a way of examining whether that sentiment is well-founded. On the other hand, critical examination must focus on social and political institutions, how they function, and the principles on which they are based. But it must also focus on the feelings of injustice and meaninglessness that are at the roots of revolt. Not all feelings of injustice are justified. For example, the feeling that a multicultural society unfairly threatens the survival of the right race is not justified. As we saw, for instance, in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021, and also in France over the past decade, feeling mass protests can be regressive as well as progressive. They can threaten the basic institutions of constitutional democracies. Therefore, critical examination and the teaching of how to develop such critical examination is not only intellectuals that are entitled to develop such critical examination, but they must teach, and I think especially of teachers and professors, how, not what to think, but how to think critically. So, critical examination is needed to explore the justification for such sentiments of injustice and insatisfaction. Similar remarks can be made about various forms of radicalization, whether religious, ideological, etc. However, critical examination does not mean moral condemnation from the outside. The process of elaborating a sentiment of revolt into a well-argued discourse is in itself a critical process. The arguments that support such a sentiment may or may not be well-founded. They may or may not be shared by disinterested interlocutors. In philosophical terms, they may or may not pass the test of their universalization, that is, of their relevance and acceptability to all possible interlocutors. 3, the debate on the meaning of collective values. And here I have in mind more specifically the work that intellectuals working in the field of humanities, I have in mind this, people working in the field of humanities, historians, professors of literature, and so on and so forth, philosophers. An important aspect of the current situation is that the values that underlie common life are no longer self-evident. Either we no longer know exactly what they mean, or we fear that these values will disappear. For example, some believers, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, fear that the values they hold dear will disappear, which is one of the reasons they may oppose any change in dogma or practice. I had in mind some examples, but it would be a bit problematic. So, on the scale of a country or an entire nation, hostility to immigration is partly related to this fear of the loss of a world, that is, of an orientation in life. In short, an important aspect of the crisis is the feeling of moral insecurity. This feeling is aggravated when it is combined with a sense of material insecurity linked to the economic crisis, unemployment, inflation, etc., which increases the fear of losing one's world. But in general, this moral crisis is developing everywhere. It is linked to 2 factors: the conflict between modernity and tradition, and the increasing diversification and heterogeneity of populations. On the one hand, technological progress and the rational organization of labor challenge certain traditional values, which is not always and necessarily a bad thing. For example, the rationalization of labor also goes a long way towards reducing gender and racial discrimination. It does not matter whether an engineer is a man or a woman. What matters is whether the person is a good engineer. So, in some ways, modernization pushes towards the reduction of discrimination on the basis of gender, culture, or social background. But in other ways, modernization challenges fundamental values. For example, modern societies pit individuals and social groups against each other, and the principle of unbridled competition undermines other values such as solidarity and empathy. Another factor in the moral crisis is the growing heterogeneity of populations, which means that our societies are becoming increasingly multicultural. Europe itself is essentially multicultural. It is multinational and multicultural. It includes a multiplicity of religions, languages, traditions, and so on. This diversity does not preclude the existence of a certain cultural unity in Europe, but this cultural unity cannot be based on the existence of a single homogeneous culture. For example, it cannot be based on the existence of a single religion, this is self-evident, nor can it be based on a single way of conceiving and practicing secularization, that is, the independence of the state from churches. There are many ways of conceiving and practicing secularization. It cannot be based on the existence of a unique common language. English will long remain a transversal language used by people who continue to speak their own language. The cultural unity of Europe will thus consist in a certain way of conceiving and organizing the coexistence and cooperation of different cultures, especially the cooperation and dialogue of different national cultures. As already mentioned, the moral crisis, that is, the feeling of uncertainty and moral insecurity, the loss of orientation or the fear of losing one's world, has political implications. We can see this when we talk about immigration. We also see it in the phenomenon of identitarian closure, when people focus on defending their national or cultural identity, etc., in order to resist what they perceive as the endangering of their world, that is, the endangering of the meaning of their existence. Such closure and radicalization are, of course, false solutions, but they point to the need to take into account a central fact. Traditions can only survive by reinterpreting themselves. They must be reinterpreted in the context of modernization and globalization, that is, in a context profoundly changed by technology, as in the current debate about artificial intelligence, and by the global interconnectedness of all societies. The self-interpretation of traditions is an essential aspect of the debate about the values that should guide action. In a democracy, whether within a country or within international institutions, the debate about values is essential because collective action is guided implicitly or explicitly by a certain understanding of some fundamental values. Of course, the technical aspects of collective action must also be taken into account. The objectives pursued must be achievable, and this depends on the means available. We must also take into account the balance of power in economic, diplomatic, and military terms. But the debate on values is nevertheless essential because it is these values that make the difference between what is essential and what is not. And here again, we can have recourse to the idea of the universalization of traditions. Universalizing the traditions means continually reinterpreting them in a way that makes them meaningful for members of other traditions. It means continually reinterpreting the values of a given tradition in a way that makes them compatible with the values of other nations, nationalities, cultural or religious communities within the framework of an emerging international community. It means reinterpreting the tradition so that it appears as a human possibility, that is, as a possible, meaningful way of living and seeing the world, especially to those who will never belong to that tradition. But this also presupposes that the members of these other traditions engage in the same process of self-reinterpretation. A diversity of cultural, moral, political, and religious traditions can not only coexist, but also make international cooperation possible and effective, provided that each of these traditions reinterpret itself in such a way as to reduce the potential for violence that it contains in the form of intolerance, contempt for other traditions, gender and racial discrimination, etc. With respect to religious traditions, This takes the form of hermeneutic debates among scholars and interpreters of the scriptures and sacred texts. But the principle of the universalization of tradition applies to all traditions, political, cultural, etc. I conclude with a few remarks on the difference between dialogue as it is practiced by scholar, by us in universities, and political discussion. I think there is a major difference between the two, between the logic of dialogue and the logic of political discussion. And I conclude with a few words on this topic. The paradigm of dialogue is not that of political discussion. It's sometimes the dream of philosophers to turn political discussion into some kind of civilized dialogue with people exchanging disinterested arguments about what should be done. And this never happens. Not because people are not well-intended, but because these are two completely different types of logic. The partners of a true dialogue must agree on the formulation of the problem, on the common principles that form the basis and starting points of the debate, and on the method to be followed in the exchange of questions and answers between the interlocutors. The goal is not to coerce or influence one another, but to agree on a common truth. Political discussion never takes the form of such dialogue. Political discussion takes place within a framework and according to procedures defined by law and institutions, but the interlocutors disagree on the basic principles or how to interpret them. They also disagree about the reality and nature of the problems. The discussion systematically mixes value considerations, justice, solidarity, etc., with the defense of interests, those of social groups, political parties, states, etc. It always takes place against the background of a struggle for power, and it is aimed at winning, if not forcing, a decision. Decisions are made on the basis of compromises, sometimes painstakingly reached, rarely in the form of consensus. Given this mixed nature of any political discussion, which is at once a negotiation of interests, a power struggle, and a debate about the guiding values of action, the discussion can always degenerate into mere bargaining between political parties, certain social groups and communities, or into sheer manipulation of citizens. In this context, the task of intellectuals and of universities and so on and so forth is to maintain a culture of dialogue, not in order to transform political discussion in a dialogue in a classic sense, but to put pressure on the political discussion, to develop a demand for dialogue on the part of the public that puts pressure on the political discussion practiced as it is practiced by politicians, so that the debate always deals with the meaning of the guiding values of collective action and is not reduced to a simple negotiation of interests or to a mere propaganda. The role of intellectuals is to prevent political debates, such as they are in their present state, from further deteriorating. As Eric Weiss says, moral condemnation and legal sanctions against the most violent forms of political propaganda may be justified, but they will never be enough to generate better debates. The only real remedy for bad discussion is to give the counterexample, wherever possible, of what good discussion is and to teach the students what it is. It is a fragile remedy, but there is no other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrice, for this very important talk. It's interesting you put forth a series of ideas that, so to speak, are motivating this entire program. So I thank you very formulating these ideas, putting them forth, and opening them for discussion. Before I open the floor, perhaps I will just ask my own couple of questions or share some remarks, and you feel free to answer or respond or not. We can just move to discussion. There is a few things that I had to think about while you were talking. One of them concerns the very basic constellation of the intellectual and the democracy, let's say. You're asking, in a sense, what is the role of an intellectual in democracy, how the intellectual can strengthen democracy. But nonetheless, you also, in a few moments of your talk, you pointed out to a certain structure or perhaps even tension between this idea of the intellectual and the idea of democracy. Most prominent for me was this moment where you pointed out how democracy has at its center the demos, the people, and how there is this idea of empowering the people, and how at a certain moment, however, there is the power of the people can become destructive for democracy. And I think it is something very true, and in many ways what we see today in many different places, that, so to speak, there is some kind of a surge. Sometimes it's called populism, some call it other names, a surge of the demos in the name of the democracy, the power of the demos, that turns against the institutions, precisely by saying, there are these institutions that are no longer represented. There is the establishment. There is, and interestingly, among the targets of this surge are also the institution of knowledge, also the intellectuals. You even use the word elites, are targeted in the name of democracy, which precisely points out to this tension between this idea of a certain class, intellectuals that possess some kind of knowledge, some kind of superiority in a certain domain vis-a-vis this idea of democracy as popular, as accessible, as egalitarian, and so forth and so forth. And it seems to me today it's something that is very strongly felt, among others, in some issues that you mentioned. For example, climate change, that in some places, in some moments of the discourse, is considered to be some kind of an intellectual, invention. And in a sense, there is some kind of a popular resistance to this, expert opinion about why we need to sacrifice, so to speak, our wealth for the sake of something that we don't even sure of. And of course, this goes back to a very old discussion about democracy. The Platonic philosophy, where democracy is a problematic constellation, and where precisely for Plato the better way to go is precisely with the intellectual, so to speak, this class that is educated, that is the philosophers, that it in some way has a different status and therefore should rule. So I wonder, how do you see that today, and in what way there is a different way of thinking about it today, and how you understand this tension as it takes place today? That would be one important question. And in relation to that, I think related to this problematic, the same problematic goes also to this idea of critical thinking. That was kind of the pride of a certain enlightenment, a certain idea of philosophy, a certain idea of the critical citizens, and so forth and so forth. But in a sense, also got a certain turn, a certain shift, and critical thinking is precisely today, in many sectors, understood as critical vis-a-vis the establishment of knowledge.
Yes,
you know, the corona, anti-corona movement and so forth, you know. These people understood themselves as critical thinkers, you know. They see beyond what is given to the public by the institutions and the scientists, and then see the real truth behind that we all somehow are misguided and so forth. So it seems to me that there is some kind of a liberal, enlightened kind of discourse, traditional European discourse that in some way received a weird shift, a weird turn where these concepts of critical thinking, of democracy, has turned against, so to speak, precisely the intellectual institution. Yeah, so that would be my question, remark. Feel free to respond to it or not, and then we'll open up for a...
Well, I will respond briefly. I think, yes, your description is right. But I think in our discussions about the role of intellectuals, we should always keep in mind that the very notion of intellectual is very ambivalent. And especially in response to your question, if by intellectuals we understand some kind of elite that is saying what people should think, and so of course it doesn't work that way, and people somehow rightfully rebel against the idea that there is an elite and they are not part of it, of course. So that is why I think teaching, you know, in the way we understand teaching in high schools, universities, is really essential. But it is about empowering the students to and make them able to make use by themselves of the concepts and criteria that enable them to critically examine things. And in this respect, I would underline something that I think is important, because I have made references to the humanities and so on and so forth. But you know, scientific education is primordial. It's for instance, about the coronavirus and so on and so forth, climate change. One of the big issues is what is a fact. We had a discussion about this this afternoon. So, what is a fact? And this is a complex notion, and it is very important for students to think about it, because this is the best way of not being simply listeners to the explanation of a so-called elite, but to participate in the, you know, in a serious way, so to speak, in the discussion about the facts that are, you know, exposed in the media and on which political decisions are being made. So it's always about, you know, making people part of the discussion by, you know, giving them the tools and the methods that make them competent interlocutors. So this is the only way to run against this idea that citizens are being despised by the elites. Sometimes it is the case, in fact. So that would be my response. But we always come to the same, you know, fact that this supposes that the state guarantee maximum access to education to the mass of citizens, and so it involves a socio-economic model and so on and so forth. So, and it is a complex question, but there is no, well, to put it frankly, there is no real democracy when you think about public discussion if you don't have a serious social policy.
No democracy without equality, in a certain way. Okay, thank you, Patrice. I open up the discussion. I think the first question.
Well, the problem you raise in your answer now, what is intellectual? Are there intellectuals today? I have the impression that the era of intellectuals who are part of the public sphere, who have authority of the intellectual, is gone. It's not, I can say in Israel, it's absolutely the old generation of some great intellectuals, mostly writers and philosophers. Some passed away, some are silent.
Yes.
And you need for intellectual influence, you need his authority. And I don't see new intellectual generation get authority, and it have reasons, of course. Now, I just give briefly the situation in Israel, because we are in a big, the era of protest, the era of change, the era of hard disputes. Intellectuals are not there. They are not the leaders. They are not the speakers. The speakers in the huge demonstrations are former politicians or army or things like this. I don't see them, I don't hear them.
Yes.
But what is more important, in some way what takes place, and this is interesting, I don't know how it is somewhere else, are people of research, sociology, etc. And the main group of this kind of intellectuals is the right-wing group.
Yes.
Who make the anti-democratic steps now because they taught the politician from the right what to do, how to think, yes. What to say. It's called the Kohelet group.
Yeah. And
it was discovered now. And somehow on the other side we have the Institution for Democracy. There are they have some authority. But when speaking about the intellectual, well, there are some teachers. The atmosphere in the universities is not to speak about politics, not to speak about theology. You are in this atmosphere. Mm-hmm. You are afraid of your job. So I think the reality, you spoke a lot about what should be.
Yes.
But the reality is not a good time for intellectual, if there are any.
Yes, right. Okay, yeah, thank you. That's why I started by mentioning that first, there are different kinds of intellectuals, and second, that intellectuals can play a very nasty role in the public debates, and we could give a lot of examples of this. So when we ask the question of the role of intellectuals in a democratic context, there are two ways of answering the question. Either it's a matter of fact, and this requires empirical analysis, what's happening in different countries and at different period in history. Okay. And another way of answering the question is to take it as a normative question. What should be the role of intellectuals? And here the risk is to develop a philosophical fantasy. Of course, it was also one point of our discussions in the previous days. So one way of answering the question understood as a normative question is to look at the kind of citizen that is, or political discussion that is implied in the legal constitutional framework of democracies. That is why I insisted on the fact that citizens are not only voters, but potential rulers. And then starting from that, of course, I develop a normative reflection, but trying to take into account the kind of idealization that is paradoxically involved in positive law. And of course, this is not what's happening. In France, I could take many examples of intellectuals who are, just, parading on TV and, and this explains why citizens feel, rejected by that kind of intellectual, by the so-called intellectual elite they feel despised, and so on and so forth. So if we were, examining empirically what's happening, of course you're right. But we cannot criticize what's happening if we don't have some kind of idea of what should be. So that's what I'm trying to do. But I insist once again, I'm not very at ease with the notion of intellectual, I must say, because it is so complex notion and it is so ambivalent. But we have to do with the word because this is the word we're using. So,
please.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrice. I want to go back to 2 points and then attach a question to that. So you mentioned that all political regimes claim to strive for the same ideals, and I think the same can be said about political parties, religions, civil society organization, etc. And attached to that, there is the notion that very often we use a certain concept and we mean very different things behind that. And I think I've seen that question coming back and again over the last 2 days. I think that a general problem that we have there is that we use the same name to signify very different things, and the other way around, different names sometimes to signify the same thing. So this is one thing. The other is the responsibility of the intellectuals. You mentioned contributing or lifting the quality of the public debate, while at the same time not reducing that to simple negotiation or to simply parading for one position. So if I link those two things, I wanted to ask you whether you think that is also the role of the intellectual to engage in that exercise that is very annoying, protracted, sort of methodological, of trying to clarify this concept, engage in this exercise of concept identification, formation, operationalization, in order to try to bring the largest number of people possible on the same understanding for the same concept? Or do you think that somehow, and I feel that might be the position of some people who are engaged in philosophy, the intellectual can be dispensed from that? It's somehow a sort of a manual exercise that is not worth of the of the philosopher or the intellectual. Thanks.
Okay, so since I am improvising my response, I will probably be simplifying things. But if we keep in mind the two kinds of intellectuals, for instance, in a public debate on television, for instance, of course, intellectuals, but in the very broad sense, including not only including scientists and so on, so forth, economists, sociologists. Okay, the debate is about, for instance, what does that mean to be independent? There is a lot of debate in Europe about independence. One of the reasons of the Brexit was to regain sovereignty. So what does sovereignty means? And of course, we have to discuss about these things. That's one case. But the other kind of intellectuals, that is, faculty members, this is the work on words that we are doing when we read texts, because there are so many texts dealing with these notions of justice, injustice, independence, freedom. You can read Thucydides, you can read, okay. And then we work with the students about what these words means, not in the idea that they will come up with a solution about the European Union, but that they will be aware of the fact that words have a meaning and they need discussion. It's not obvious. And that it's not enough to say, well, justice, freedom, this is what politicians do, justice, freedom, and all is said, and it means nothing. Because when we come to concrete policy making, then you have to have a more concrete and detailed idea of what sovereignty means, for instance, or justice means, and there the conflict starts. So I would say that the discussion that we had this afternoon about the meaning of words, which is part of our work as faculty members, is not directly but indirectly essential for educating the public opinion. But I mean educating not in the sense that students are passively listening to what, but that they become active in the way they themselves discuss the terms and sometimes disagree with us. So
How many questions are in the room, just to be able to? 1, 2, 3, 4. So I suggest we'll take the first two and then the last two. Is it okay, Fabrice? We'll
yes, of course.
2 questions at a time?
Yes, yes.
So first question and second question.
I couldn't help but hear echoes of Julian Bender in your talk. And as you were talking also, the way you spoke about politics, I enjoyed your talk very much, I'll say. But the way you talked about political dialogue, I think, is absolutely right. A democracy cannot work without compromise. It cannot work if everyone gets what they want. So the layer that you didn't address, but I'm not saying it's not because you haven't thought of it, but just to bring it into the equation, is the socio-economic one. And of course, with intellectuals, I'm reminded of Marx's critique of Hegel, in the philosophy of right. We talked about the bureaucracy being the universal class. Marx mocks that. And the intellectuals supposedly are the universal class, but in order to fulfill that, I'm hearing what you say, I believe, they need to live by a certain spirit, but they don't. And there's socio-economic ideational reasons why they don't, why consensus is formed, why the recruitment strategy of the elite. And I don't think that's a dirty word. I think Gaetano Mosca is a wonderful sociologist, and I think he identifies every society has an elite, and in our society, it's an ideational recruitment strategy in terms of the role and function of ideas and those that teach them. But the cleavage, it seems to me, is in the values, which is also socio-economically related, but the values are just absolutely cloven. There's just no way in which one set of values can be held if the other set of values triumphs. And you can hear that, especially in the way that language, I'll put another way. You can hear that in the way in which all problems now are seen as ideological problems. And part of the root of that is in a very simple formula. It became very widespread in the 60s. I'm not saying the problem begins there, but the formulation was everything is politics. And when everything is politics, then it's understandable why intellectuals see themselves as political saviours, because they have the true, the good and the beautiful ideas, and their ideas will bring about a much more emancipated society. The problem, of course, is in politics, people don't do what you think you want them to do because they have different experiences, different values at work.
Yeah.
We'll just take another question. And then, okay. So the second question is for the gentleman here at the end of the...
Someone once said that there wouldn't be good management of the state unless the kings become philosophers or the philosophers become kings. Well, for democracy, I think you have to turn it around, that there won't be good democracy unless intellectuals are the voters or the voters become intellectuals. And until that happens, a government of the people, by the people, but not for the intellectuals, may not work. And the government has the power to say no.
Yeah. Right. Well, in fact, the question of values is, of course, extremely complex and much more complex than I, made it in this talk for lack of time, of course. But it is true that intellectuals very often can be simply ideologues that provide the justification for any kind of policy. But and it is true that with respect to Hegel's philosophy of right. Well, of course, Hegel was not a Democrat, so that's why he needed this universal class, the administration, overlooking the fact that the administration may be in the service of a certain social class. In fact, the administration is not the universal class. because there is no universal class. That is why, of course, I am again simplifying the answer. That is why what is important is the interplay between the different, not only social classes, but also between citizens and the government and so on and so forth, because each one of these groups or layers has a point of view and interest to defend that is particular. And the universal is the result of the confrontation of these particularities. So when people are really trying to solve the problem, they will somehow overcome the biases that are involved in their own way of thinking, because otherwise there will be no solution. And if there is no solution, we all are going down. So sometimes citizens know that and they think, okay, we are going down. But if we take this process seriously of reciprocal correction of the biases, the universal is always provisional. It's always a momentary result. And saying this is very abstract, but in concrete terms is that at a certain moment, in order to solve a certain problem, for instance, the reformation of the health system, we decide whether people will pay entirely for their cures or if the social state will enable all people to access health care. We have to decide on a certain concept of justice, because this concept has some kind of organizational power. So it's not only a matter of ideology in this case. If you look at the logic of compromise making, so at one point people will, come together and try to make the most of the agreement that they will reach, for instance, between labor unions and the government and so on and so forth. But if the compromise is destined to be stable, to endure, and not to fall down after a few months, it not only needs to accommodate the different interests, it needs to be meaningful. To be meaningful for the participants, otherwise it will not endure. And then the solution is that now, in these circumstances, we think we agree on the fact that this model of social justice is what we need. Maybe in 10 years it will be different. So that is why not everything is a question of ideology, and that is why intellectuals, are. In fact, it's not intellectuals that matters. It is the fact that they must help people to think in that way, to be able to make compromises, and to be able to think in terms of concepts that make possible and stable compromises. What is justice when I speak of a health system, about Medicare? If we cannot agree on such a value, you cannot reform the system. So this is what I added. I understand that I have not answered the entirety of your question, but I'm just reacting to what you said.
You also want to react to the...
Oh, yes. Well, to make things worse, I would say, again, have in mind the fact that intellectuals, it is a very ambivalent concept. There are so many kinds of intellectuals, despite what I have said of this, the kind of idealization that I have developed. Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, would say, beware the intellectuals, because normal people for Rousseau, we should discuss that. But there is some common sense in the people that intellectuals destroy by developing the taste for sophistry, abstract rhetoric, nonsensical, philosophical, thesis, and so on and so forth. So to make things worse, I would say that we could say, well, to the idea that all citizens should become intellectuals, well, we don't know. We don't know. So what we're speaking about is not about citizens becoming intellectuals, but about intellectuals playing a role in enabling people of making their own judgment. they don't need to be intellectuals themselves because they have other things to do. But intellectuals may play a role in this part.
Last two questions, I believe. Here we have a question, Amir.
My question was already asked, so...
Okay. So, Gesine, please, you have the honor of the last question.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, thank you very much for this great talk. It inspired me to give up a question for tomorrow, actually, somehow together with the entire day we have behind us. Because I was thinking, when you demanded that people should think in the democracy as if they were responsible for the governmental decision, somehow it seems to me as if normativity, I usually argue very strongly for normativity, but it seems to me as if normativity has won the better of everything which I would call intellectual Spielfreude, which is, how would you translate this? The joy of playing.
Of playing, yes.
We had this, in Frank's contribution, we had this interest in language, right? That at a certain point you don't have to produce immediately some solution to any problem, but you have to rather open up a space in order to first playfully try arguments and possibilities, and also somehow just stand still in front of a problem which cannot be solved immediately. And that intellectuals at least also have this task, not in order to be politicians, but in order to provide, for example, a room to which politicians in their debates with intellectuals and with the society can go and say, okay, we might see it otherwise. It could be that our way of thinking things is not prefigured and should not be ridden by normativity. It seems to me right now that intellectuals proper are very much themselves engaged in a kind of strict normativity, right? Everything is a matter of high morals. Everything is a matter of justice at its limits. And I even sensed in our day, if I may say so, that people from the theater try to give academic arguments, and people who are classical philologists were more playful in displaying their arguments and changing things and playing with words. And perhaps this is a question just for tomorrow to go on with the conference.
Yes, but I understand. I agree with you that there must be some space for that kind of, play, as you say, and of course. There must be some space for gratuitous, free discussion without having in mind necessarily, the necessity to rush to a certain decision and so on and so forth. So, but at the end of the day, we make the decisions. If there is a referendum in France about leaving the European Union or not, we are going to say yes or no, and this is a very serious matter. So we sorry.
With or without any discussion, as in England. Without.
Yeah.
I mean, in England it was without discussion.
Yes.
No point.
Yeah.
Voted on it.
Yes.
And there being a discussion.
Yeah. So, but I think that the question is not about, reflecting on this matter, 6 months before the referendum. The fact that we entertain this idea of freely, maybe playing with, no, not playing, but freely thinking about things without having in mind the decision that we are going to make right now. This is necessary. So, but eventually, at one point, we make the decision, and very often we are not conscious of the decision that we are making, because there is so much manipulation in the public, in the political sphere. So, but I think what I was saying, of course, it's a kind of idealization. But when you come to think about what we're supposed to do when we vote for a political party, we are supposed to assess the platform that they are proposing. Most of the time, we know nothing about it. even intellectuals, they know very little of the political platforms, if there is any, and not simple, words. But still, what we are supposed to do is to examine the different solutions to the problem, which are real problems, for instance, access to education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And we're supposed to be able to do, this is sensical, this is nonsensical. So at one point we have to decide by ourselves, or others will decide for us.
How many intellectuals does it take to change a light bulb?
Sorry?
Nine.
A light bulb.
Nine.
Please help me thank Fabrice.
Thank you.
Help me thank Patrice for this wonderful talk that opened up many questions that I'm sure will give you much discussions for the next days. Thank you very much for being with us, for your engaged participation, and I wish you all a very nice evening.
Thank you for your questions and for the discussion.